The hallway outside my apartment always smelled faintly of detergent and old wood. I'd been here 3 months and still wasn't used to how quiet it got after 9 p.m., the way you could hear the hum of the vending machine from the lobby if you stood still long enough. Tonight, I was halfway through reheating leftover pasta when the water from my kitchen sink decided to overflow. It wasn't dramatic, just a steady drip that turned into a small stream, pooling under my dish rack. I had no idea who to call. The building's manager only answered during the day. For a while, I just stood there with the tap running slow and my phone in my hand, not calling anyone. Then I thought of her. She lived 2 doors down. I'd spoken to her maybe 4 times, short exchanges in the laundry room, a smile when we passed each other at the mailboxes. She had that presence that made you lower your voice without realizing it, like you'd stepped into a quieter room. I knocked. It took a moment before she opened the door, leaning against the frame in an oversized cardigan, her hair tied up in a loose knot. She looked at me, then at the dripping sound still echoing faintly from my apartment. "Trouble?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, scratching the back of my neck. "Sink's leaking. I think." "Not sure who else to come in," she interrupted, not unkindly. Her place was warm in a way mine wasn't. A faint smell of tea and something citrusy. She crossed the room to grab a small toolbox from under a side table. I caught myself glancing at her hands, short nails, no polish, the kind of hands that looked like they did a lot without needing to prove it. "You don't look like someone who owns a toolbox," I said. She smirked without looking at me. "I've lived alone for a while. You either learn or you pay people who don't show up on time." Back in my kitchen, she crouched under the sink, fiddling with the pipe like she'd done it 100 times. I leaned on the counter, unsure if I should offer help or just watch. "Hand me that towel," she said. I did, careful not to brush against her fingers, but feeling the warmth from them linger anyway. She fixed the leak in under 10 minutes. Wiped her hands. Looked up at me. "You're not leaving tonight," she said, like it was a fact, not an invitation. I blinked. "What?" "You said you had plans," she continued, standing now. "Cancel them. It's late. Sit. I'll make tea." I almost told her it wasn't that late. That I didn't even have real plans, just a vague idea of going out so I didn't feel like someone who stayed home too much. But instead, I found myself nodding. "All right," I said. "I'll cancel." She moved around my kitchen like she'd been there before, finding mugs, running the kettle. I watched her from the table, fingers drumming lightly against the wood. Every now and then, she glanced at me like she was checking if I'd changed my mind. When she slid a mug toward me, the steam curled between us. I didn't say anything. Neither did she. It wasn't awkward, just quiet, like the space between 2 songs on a record. Later, when she left, I noticed she'd forgotten her thermos on the counter. I reached for my phone, thumb hovering over her name in my contacts, the one I'd saved but never used. For some reason, I didn't send the message. The thermos sat on my counter for 2 days before I saw her again. I told myself I'd return it right away, but there was something about having it there, like proof that she'd been in my kitchen, leaning under my sink, telling me I wasn't leaving. When I finally knocked, she opened the door halfway, a tea towel over one shoulder. "You kept it hostage long enough," she said, taking the thermos. "I was busy," I lied. We both knew it. She stepped aside, letting me in. The window was open, letting in the sound of rain hitting the awning outside. She moved around the room, folding laundry in practiced motions. I picked up a book from her coffee table, a worn paperback with the spine bent almost in half. "You read this?" I asked. "A long time ago," she said, not looking up. "My husband hated that one. Said it was too slow, nothing happened. I liked that about it. It took me a second to register. You're divorced. She paused in folding a sweater, then shrugged. 7 years now. You learned to fill the quiet. I didn't push, but something in her voice stayed with me, the way quiet sounded heavier than the word usually did. She offered me tea, and I sat at her small dining table, watching her hands move as she poured. We didn't talk much, but every now and then I caught her looking at me like she was measuring something, not distrust, exactly, but distance. Do your parents know you live here? She asked suddenly. I smiled. I'm 24. They don't really keep tabs on me. That's not what I asked, she said, and the corner of her mouth lifted just slightly. It was then I felt the quiet rules of whatever this was, unspoken but sharp. She was older. Lived alone. I was young enough for people to assume things before they knew anything at all. And maybe she knew it too. We drank tea while the rain eased outside. She told me about the neighbor upstairs who dropped coins in the stairwell every Tuesday night for reasons no one understood. I told her about the time I locked myself out of my dorm room wearing only a towel. She laughed, not loud, but enough that I felt it in my chest. When I left, she walked me to the door, leaning against the frame just like the first night. I stepped out, and for a moment, she rested her hand lightly against my arm. Just a second, maybe less. I don't know why that moment stayed with me, maybe because it felt like someone finally saw me. The rain had stopped by the next week, but she wasn't at her door, in the hall, or in the laundry room. 3 days passed. Then 4. I told myself I wasn't looking for her, but I caught myself listening for the soft click of her apartment lock every time I walked past. When I finally saw her, it was in the lobby. She was carrying groceries, a bag heavier than she could manage with one arm. I offered to help, but she shook her head. I've got it, she said. She didn't. The bag tipped, an apple rolling across the tile. I picked it up and followed her to the elevator. She pressed the button for her floor, and for a moment we stood there in that humming, metal box, too close, neither of us leaning back. You've been busy? I asked. Work. One word, clipped. Something had shifted. In her kitchen, I set the bag down. She started putting things away without looking at me. I noticed a second mug on her counter, not mine. You had company? I said, too casually. Her hands slowed over the fruit bowl. A friend. She didn't turn around. We both knew the conversation was over before it began. I watched her move, slower now, deliberate, like she was keeping her thoughts just out of reach. I stayed anyway. She made tea. We sat at the table, each with our own mug, steam curling and fading in the still air. I wanted to ask if she'd missed me. Instead, I asked about the book on her counter. She told me she hadn't read it yet. That she wasn't sure she'd like it. Halfway through the tea, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then set it face down. No explanation. I leaned back, arms crossed. If you're busy, I'm not. She looked at me then, finally, and it wasn't cold. Just, guarded. Like she was deciding whether to open the door a little or keep it shut. The quiet stretched until it was almost unbearable. I caught myself noticing her hand on the table, the curve of her fingers, the slight twitch when she shifted. My own hand moved before I could think. Stopped halfway. Her eyes flicked down, then back up. The kettle whistled softly in the background, even though neither of us had turned it on again. And just as the space between us felt like it might break, there was a knock at her door. Sharp. 3 times. She pulled her hand back and stood. It's probably my neighbor, she said, though she didn't sound sure. I stayed at the table while she opened the door a crack, speaking low to someone I couldn't see. When she came back, she was smiling, but not at me, the kind of polite smile you give to no one in particular. We didn't touch again that night. But when I left, she watched me walk down the hall, her gaze following until I turned the corner. And I couldn't stop thinking, if the knock hadn't come, what would have happened? It was late afternoon, the kind where the sun's low enough to turn everything gold, but the air's still cool. I found her sitting on the bench outside the building, a paper cup of coffee balanced between her hands. "Thought you didn't like sitting out here," I said, lowering myself onto the other end of the bench. "I don't," she said. "But it's too quiet inside." We watched a kid from the next block ride his bike in lazy circles, his jacket flapping behind him. She sipped her coffee. I could hear the faint scrape of her thumb against the cardboard cup sleeve. "You've been avoiding me," I said finally. Her eyes stayed on the street. "I've been thinking." I waited, but she didn't go on. "About you." It was soft, but the words still caught in the air. "And how this," she gestured vaguely between us, "isn't something I planned for." I swallowed. Neither did I. She gave a small, almost rueful laugh. "That's the problem." We sat in a kind of silence that isn't empty, more like the weight of something neither of us wanted to unpack. The kid's bike chain clicked faintly as he pedaled past again. Who was the guy with the extra mug? The question came out before I could pull it back. Her head turned then, eyes narrowing just slightly. "A friend. That's all." "Right." She studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "You're too young to be jealous over something you don't understand yet." The word stung more than I expected. I looked down at my hands. "Maybe I don't understand. But I know I stopped." The sentence felt too big in my mouth. Her voice softened. "You what?" I shook my head. "Forget it." "No," she leaned in just a fraction. "Say it." The air felt thinner between us. "I keep thinking about the night you told me not to leave," I said. Like it meant something you're not saying. Her lips parted slightly, like she might answer, but then she closed them again. Looked away. The sun slid behind a cloud, dimming the light. She set her coffee down beside her and rubbed her hands together, as if suddenly cold. "You don't know what you're asking for," she said finally. "And I'm not sure I could handle it if you did." For a second, I thought she might reach for me. My hand twitched on the bench between us, hers just inches away. She glanced at it, then back at me. "Do you want me to?" she asked. I didn't see her for over a week. Not in the hall. Not in the lobby. Not even in the laundry room where we used to run into each other without trying. At first, I told myself she was busy. Then I started walking past her door on purpose, slowing just enough to listen. Nothing. By day 8, I caved and texted her, "You okay?" No reply. On the 10th day, I saw her. She was at the far end of the street, walking with a boy who looked about 16. Same brown eyes. Same slope of the jaw. He carried a backpack and was laughing at something she'd said. She didn't see me. Or maybe she did and just didn't let it show. That night, she texted. "Sorry. Been occupied. My son's staying for a bit." Son. The word landed heavier than it should have. Not because it was bad, just because it explained so much and nothing at all. The next afternoon, I caught her at the mailbox. She was polite, smiling, but different, like we'd been moved back a few chapters. "How've you been?" I asked. "Good. Just busy." She glanced toward the stairwell. Listen, I should, and she was gone, the door shutting before I could think of something to keep her there. The pattern shifted after that. No more tea. No long silences that weren't really silence. When we did see each other, it was in passing, a nod, a quick, hey. I started avoiding the bench outside, even when the weather was perfect. I told myself I was giving her space. Truth was, I didn't know where I stood anymore, and not knowing felt worse than being told outright. One night, coming home late, I saw her apartment light on. Her window was open, the sound of quiet music drifting out, something soft, almost a lullaby. I stood there on the sidewalk, hands in my pockets, telling myself I could knock. I didn't. I went inside instead, sat at my kitchen table, and opened a blank message on my phone. I typed, I missed the way it was. I stared at it for a long time. My thumb hovered over send, but the more I looked at the words, the more they seemed like something I wasn't allowed to say. I erased them. Put the phone face down. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt paused. Like life forgot to finish the sentence. It was late when I heard the knock. 3 short taps, like the first night, when my sink had leaked. When I opened the door, she was standing there in her coat, hair damp from rain. No umbrella. She didn't ask if she could come in, just stepped past me and stood in the middle of my kitchen. I didn't mean to disappear, she said, her voice low. I closed the door. But you did. She didn't argue. She looked around like she'd been expecting something to have changed. The thermos she'd left months ago still sat on top of my fridge. I hadn't returned it, maybe on purpose. My son went back home this morning, she said. I was going to stop by earlier, but, she trailed off, shaking her head. I leaned against the counter. But? She pressed her lips together, thinking. You make it too easy to forget there's a line. The words landed heavier than I expected. Do you want there to be one? Yes. She met my eyes. And no. We just stood there, the hum of the fridge filling the space between sentences. I wanted to tell her everything I hadn't said, how I thought about her in the quiet parts of my day, how the sound of her laugh stayed with me longer than it should. But speaking felt like it might break something we couldn't put back. Still, I heard myself say, I don't want this to stop. Even if it's nothing. Even if it's just tea in your kitchen. She smiled, but it was tired. It's not nothing. That's the problem. I took a step closer. Her eyes flicked down, then back up. The air between us felt charged, not with the urgency to touch, but with the knowledge that we might. You scare me a little, she admitted. Why? Because you're still figuring out who you are. And I'm already tired of pretending I'm not watching you do it. It wasn't a confession. Not entirely. But it was the closest we'd come. I nodded slowly, my hand brushing hers on the counter. Neither of us pulled away. I'm here, I said. For however long you let me be. She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for weeks. Then she turned her hand over and let her fingers rest against mine, just enough to make the point without making a promise. Okay, she said. That was it. No kiss. No declarations. Just her standing in my kitchen, damp from the rain, holding my hand like it was something fragile we'd agreed not to name. By the time spring came around, the rain had eased into something gentler, the kind that didn't keep you inside, just slowed your walk a little. She was on the bench one morning when I stepped out, the same one she'd sat on months ago with that cooling cup of coffee. I checked my phone. 8:47 a.m. Not a time we usually crossed paths. You're up early, I said. So are you. She moved her bag aside so I could sit. We didn't talk about the weeks that had passed since the night in my kitchen. We didn't need to. Our silences had changed, they weren't holding anything back anymore, just making room for what didn't need to be said. She had tea in a travel cup, steam curling into the cool air. I had my black coffee. The smells mingled in a way that reminded me of her apartment, warm citrus and something deeper, a scent you couldn't name but would know anywhere. "You fixed the sink yet?" she asked, not looking at me. "No. I was hoping you'd do it again," I said. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You're hopeless." A kid on a bike, maybe the same one from last fall, rode past us, calling out to a friend. The sound drifted, then faded. We sat there, watching the street wake up. I realized then that whatever we were, we'd stopped trying to fit it into something tidy. She didn't pull away anymore. I didn't push for more than she could give. And somewhere in the middle, we'd found something that felt better than the first rush, steady, almost ordinary, but ours. Sometimes I'd have tea in her kitchen. Sometimes she'd have coffee in mine. We still had pauses, but they'd softened, no sharp edges, no unsent messages. I glanced at her, and she was already looking at me. Not searching. Just seeing. "Why are you smiling?" she asked. "Because I like this," I said. "This?" "Yeah. Just, this." She didn't answer, but she reached into her bag and pulled out the old thermos she'd left in my apartment months ago. "Set it between us on the bench. Guess you can keep it now," she said. I picked it up, turning it in my hands. "Souvenir. Something like that." We stayed there until the street was fully awake, until the sun warmed the bench enough to make us both lean back. No big moment, no sudden decision, just her next to me, the thermos warm in my hands, and the quiet certainty that this was where I was supposed to be. I didn't need more than that. Neither did she. I think that's what made it love.